California educates 6.2 million school children in K through 12, nearly 1/8 of all students in the U.S. By most accounts, the dollars that districts receive from the state and how those dollars may be used have been described as unnecessarily complex, irrational, and inequitable. Some argue that California is doing a poor job of matching resources with student needs. Governor Jerry Brown agrees. As a result, he's proposing a dramatic change in the way school districts receive and spend state funds, focusing more dollars on districts with high numbers of poor students or students who don't speak English at home. In short, those students that have the greatest need, and giving school districts more local control on how to spend state dollars. We'll examine the details of the governor's proposal and their prospects for being enacted with Rachel Ellers, a specialist in school finance with the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office, Michael Kirst, president of the California Board of Education, and Dean Vogel, president of the California Teachers Association. School finance reform. Show me the money.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Former State Senator Joe Simitian once compared California's Byzantine school financing system to the Winchester Mystery House, where rooms are added willy-nilly to solve one problem or another. Fortunately, we have someone who can help us navigate our way through this financial maze. She is Rachel Ellers, a Harvard graduate and a specialist in school finance with the California Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's set the stage for school financing in California. In 1978, we had Prop 13, which limited residential property taxes, the source of most school funding up to that point. Then 10 years later, in 1988, the voters passed Prop 98, which required a minimum percentage of the state budget be spent on K through 14 education. So what impact did Prop 13 and Prop 98 have on education funding?
Well, you're exactly right. Prop 13 limited the amount of local property tax that could be raised, and that limited the amount of local funds that could go to education. So really the effect was to shift the primary responsibility for funding K-12 schools to the state. So Prop 98 was in large part a response to this idea that now the state's largely responsible for funding schools. It's competing against a lot of other priorities within the state budget. So it was really, I think, an attempt to give some protected status around education funding. And just like you said, it's a minimum requirement the state has to give to schools each year.
Well, it's kind of he who has the gold makes the rules. In this case, the state has the gold. So one thing they have is something called categoricals. We can talk about that. But how is school financing currently, how does it currently work?
Well, you're exactly right. The Proposition 98 established a minimum requirement for how much had to go for schools, but it didn't really speak to how those dollars had to be spent. So as the state has taken larger responsibility for funding schools, the state's also taken a larger role in deciding how those funds are going to be spent. So right now, we're at about $47 billion for Prop 98 that goes to schools, and about 3/4 of that goes to local level for school districts to decide how to spend. Mostly they spend it on teachers and administrators. There's another 1/4 of those funds that we call categorical money, as you mentioned, and those are grants that the state decides how locals need to spend them. So we spend one grant, provide it to the local level, say you need to use this for renting school buses. You need to use this one for ESL tutoring. You need to use this one for buying textbooks.
So you give them money, but there's strings attached.
Exactly right.
You know, you've described the current school financing system as overly complex, irrational, inequitable, inefficient, and highly centralized. Other than that, apparently no problems. Seriously, what are your concerns?
Other than that, it's perfect. Most of our concerns revolve around these categorical programs that we've mentioned, and they're really twofold. First, it's very kind of state-driven. There's not a lot of room for local innovation, local decision-making, local priorities. It's really Sacramento telling districts how they should spend the dollars. The second is that they're very antiquated. They're based on historical formulas, and they're not really linked to current student needs. So how many school buses you were running in 1977, that's how much money you're getting right now, regardless of who your students are and what your needs are today.
Let me ask you about the cuts that schools have received over the period of this people call the Great Recession. How big have those cuts been?
You know, our estimate since 2007-8, K-12 funding's dropped by about $3.7 billion, which is about 8%.
8% cut. And so what does that mean to parents like me who have kids in school? How does that play out in school districts?
You know, school districts have adapted to these cuts in various ways. I think the two biggest changes we've seen is shorter school years, less instructional days, and larger class sizes. So some school districts have gone down one road or the other, and in some communities they may see a combination of both. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're seeing the things improving, financial situation of the state improving. How much is school funding likely to go up in 2013 and 2014?
Well, under the governor's budget proposal that was just released, it goes up about $2 billion. So not quite to pre-recession levels, but creeping back up. It's about a 5% increase compared to the school year we're in the middle of now.
So what are schools going to do with that money? I'm guessing, is it going to go toward categoricals, or categoricals going to be eliminated? Strings attached, not local control? What's going to happen?
It's the $50 billion question right now. Well, I think that's what we're all debating, and what the governor has laid a proposal on the table. But I think that's one of the big questions is okay, funding's going to increase. Are we going to rebuild the exact same system we had, or are there going to be some changes? Okay, well, when we come back, we'll talk about the particulars of the governor's proposal to dramatically reform the way state money is allocated to local school districts. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Improving K-12 education has been a top priority for Governor Brown. In this year's budget, he's proposing a different way on how to spend school money. He believes that school money should be spent more on those districts that have economically disadvantaged or ESL students, English as a second language. But how is that going to work? We're talking with Rachel Ellers, a specialist in school finance with the California Legislative Analyst Office. So it's been said that the governor wants to simplify funding streams, give more local control to school boards, and give more money to districts that have low-income students and students who don't speak English fluently. How does he plan to do all that? Well, I think in a nutshell, he would take the vast bulk of the state money we provide to districts right now, general purpose money and these categorical programs with specific restrictions we've been discussing, put them all together and send them out in a much more streamlined fashion. Each district would get a base grant per kid, the same amount across the state per kid, and then some additional funding based on a few select additional characteristics. Students learning English, as you mentioned, from low-income families, districts with high concentrations of these types of kids, and then some additional funding for elementary schools or high schools based on some differential costs. But the bulk of this funding would go to districts. They could decide how to spend the money. No more spending restrictions.
So no strings attached. Are there going to be winners and losers in this process? I mean, money is the pot of money is a zero-sum situation. So it would seem like there's going to be winners and losers here.
Well, I think the way the governor has framed it is focusing on the additional money, so as the pot grows. So under his proposal, he sets a pretty high target for this base amount that each district would get and would work towards that over time.
So all districts would be gaining money?
Almost every district, I think they estimate 90% would get some new money. It's just the amount of new money each district would get would differ. So I think everyone is crunching their own numbers at each district across the state to see how much more they would get under the new proposed system or the current system. I think it's important to note, though, the governor's not proposing to reallocate funding that districts currently have. It's really a discussion about how do we allocate new funds.
The extra. What kind of percentage, how much more will these districts with economically disadvantaged students and ESL students get under the new weighted formula?
Well, we haven't seen all the runs yet. The administration is still kind of crunching the numbers for each district. But in concept, a mainstream student would get $1, a disadvantaged student would get an additional 35 cents on the dollar. So, and then districts with high concentrations of these types of kids would get even more. So it really is notably more.
What about some of those districts? I assume already they're getting some money from the federal government and the state government because they have these economically disadvantaged students. Is that going to be part of the amount of money that they receive, or is that going to be on top of these new extra monies?
It would be in addition and separate. Typically right now we run our state system pretty independently from the federal system. There are federal grants for low-income students and for English learners, but the amount of money there, it's less than $2 billion. It's actually relatively small compared to what the governor is proposing for this new additional supplement.
So the governor wants to pay for all this by basically eliminating the categoricals. Haven't a lot of the categoricals already been suspended? How much money are we talking about here?
Right. So over the past few years, because of the fiscal difficulties that the state and local districts have been facing, the legislature a few years ago flexed about 40 of the 60 categoricals that we have.
When you say flex, that means basically eliminated.
Removed the restrictions, kept the same allocations, but removed the restrictions.
So the district could decide if they wanted to spend that money there or not.
Exactly right. They could use it for any purpose. That was about $4.5 billion out of the roughly $11.5 billion we give in categoricals. But under current law, the flexibility period is projected to expire within the next couple of years. So under current law, all the spending restrictions would come back into place.
So they're getting all this extra money, but there are no common set of accounting rules for school districts. So how can we be sure that the extra money that they're getting is actually going to be spent on schools where the neediest kids are, as opposed to just going to the district office and being spent on something else?
Well, we have a common set of accounting rules, but our current funding and accounting system is based at the district level, not at the school site level. And so that would be the same under the governor's proposal. It's really focused at the district, not all the way down to the school site. The governor would propose that districts would have to adopt a plan at the beginning of the year for how they would spend the funds, and that would be publicly available.
What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of the governor's plan?
You know, we think it's a great first step, really improves local control, funds similar students similarly at different districts, no matter where they attend. We do have some concerns, back to your last question, about making sure that the additional dollars that are intended to serve needy students translate to additional services. So maybe some broad spending parameters we might recommend.
Well, let's get to the recommendations. What kind of recommendations do you have to modify the governor's plan?
Well, we're still analyzing this version of his plan, but there was something similar last year, and we did recommend, as I mentioned, some more broad spending parameters, not all the way down to the school site level, but some assurance that these additional funds dedicated to needy students translate to additional services for those needy students. But in broad strokes, the general framework, we think, is a really good starting place.
Great. Well, I want to thank Richard Ellers with the California Legislative Analyst's Office for joining us. When we come back, we'll discuss the policy issues involved with changing the way money is allocated to school districts with two key players in that debate, the presidents of the California Board of Education and the California Teachers Association. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. The governor's call to restructure school finance has begun a serious debate about how to best educate California's 6.2 million school children. We're fortunate to have two leaders in that debate with us today. Michael Christ is the president of the California Board of Education, and Dean Vogel is president of the California Teachers Association. Welcome to the Maddy Report. Well, the governor's calling for a new approach to school financing, referred to as the weighted pupil funding formula. That's a mouthful. Essentially, it's going to give more money to districts with high numbers of poor students or students who don't speak English at home. One of the major areas of contention is how high the base funding should be, and that is the minimum amount per student that every district's going to receive. So what are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, I think the base level needs to be robust, and the proposal for a unified district that has all the grades in it is about $7,700 now. So we've increased it substantially. But the key thing is that the current system has no underlying rationale. It's an historical accretion, which is exceedingly complex and does not adjust for the pupil needs across California. So the current system to me is indefensible as being rational, equitable, or meeting student needs.
What about this? Is there like a zero-sum nature to this debate? I mean, if you give more to one district, isn't another district going to get less?
Look, public education in California has lost $20 billion over the last 5 years. And so even though we applaud the governor for this attempt to really make school funding and finance a little bit more palatable for just the average guy, we really believe it's essential that we bring back the funding, repay the districts. Now, the governor's plan, increases the base funding, and we think that's a good move, and is talking about phasing in this repayment over 7 years. We don't know any of the details yet. And, probably within, a week or so, we're going to see some models and give us a sense of like just what that funding is going to look like. But basically, we really believe, we're 49th in the country right now in per pupil funding. And really believe it's essential that we, get that base back to, where it needs to be.
Did we recently drop in that category? I thought I read somewhere that we dropped in per pupil.
Yeah, from 47th to 49th. And of course, this is, taking into consideration, just the cost of living and all of that.
Okay. Let me ask you another question about this thing called the concentration factor. I don't want to get too wonkish here, but that's the idea that districts that have higher proportions of high-need students should get money above and beyond this base rate and this weighted formula. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the recognition that it costs more to educate certain groups of students than others is very positive. I mean, educators across the state agree. The critical factor is How do you identify those kids? Take, for example, English language learners. Across the state, the methods used to identify those students differ from district to district, and in some districts from student to student. So there's got to be a system that's consistent statewide.
Is that going to be a problem, Michael? I mean, so it'll give an incentive to some districts to classify students a certain way?
It could be, but for the English learners who are not low income, the proposal would allow them to only be in the program and be counted for 5 years. So, and we're also going to come up with more uniform definitions for funding. They can have a different definition for educating kids, but for funding it'll be pretty uniform. Let me add that the current system has 56 earmarked categorical programs. It just ties them in knots. Some of these goes back to the 1960s. We're phasing in a new curriculum at much higher level. You can't get there from here in a local district if the state ties you into 56 categories.
Let me ask you about the issue of transparency then. We're just kind of touching on that. If these districts are getting more money, more dollars, how can we be sure that the money is going to be going to these high-need, high-risk students and not just going to the district office?
The proposal by the governor requires the districts, when they do their budgets and their budget cycle every year, to have a clear plan and show how they're going to allocate the money so that the low-income students get the money that is in the state formula. So we have put in a new mechanism and tied it to their annual budget process, and they'll have to be transparent about that with their local public.
You know, the governor's also talking about increasing local control, and that is, he's going to do that by eliminating this thing called categoricals. What are your thoughts about that? Are these categoricals too important to leave to local school districts, or should the money come with no strings attached?
I think there are certain things that we have to, pay pretty critical attention to.
Well, can we give an example of a categorical? For example, class size.
I was just going to say class size reduction. Current statute has class size reduction at 1 to 20, and of course there are waivers and this or that. The governor's proposal has it at 1 to 24. I think class size reduction is really critical and very popular with teachers and with parents. And so to the degree that we can actually maintain this idea of lower class size, it's going to be really good for everybody. I think the critical component here, and Michael just expressed it, there has got to be accountability in this system that is easy to understand. There should be audits annually. There should be consistent measures for determining which students qualify for more money, or which percentages of students qualify.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll talk about the governor's weighted formula and when should it be implemented. Now, or wait until all education cuts have been restored and all debts paid off. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. K-14 education is the single largest piece of the state budget, taking up over 40% of the general fund and dwarfing other state expenditures. As the state's financial outlook begins to brighten, the question becomes how to spend the money. Should the governor's weighted formula be implemented now, or should we wait until the cuts have been restored to education and all the debts paid off? So we're talking with Michael Christ, President of the California Board of Education, and Dean Vogel, President of the California Teachers Association. So, Dean, what about that? Should the revenues that we're getting now be used to restore the cuts that have occurred to education before the weighted formula is phased in?
Considering a $20 billion cut to K-14 over the last, say 4 or 5 years, it really is essential that we get the base funding back to, where it needs to be. And
are you saying that there shouldn't be, the weighted formula should not happen until all the cuts have been restored?
No, I'm saying that we should be phasing it in and be thoughtful that, there's tremendous pressures coming on district. The implementation of the Common Core is before everybody. And, the question that's begged is who's responsible for funding that? Is that going to lay, the responsibility going to lay onto locals, or does the state have a responsibility to assist locals in that? There are big questions around equity and implementation of Common Core, and also, let's not forget class size reduction.
Well, what do you think, Michael?
Well, the governor's proposal phases the weights for low-income and English learner students in over 5 to 7 years, and also pays down the deferrals and some of the past things that we've been cutting them. So our proposal is to do both simultaneously and phase it in, and it's particularly strong in the outer years. Our budget gets much better in a 3 to 5 year range from now. So this was never meant to be done overnight.
Well, let me ask you this. You know, schools get other government money, other federal and state money. Should that be added on to the weighted formula, or should that be part of the calculation?
The federal money is really done by the federal government, and I think that shouldn't be taken into account. It's only about 10% of the expenditures, and actually school districts get very little local money. A few of them have parcel taxes. They collect some money from lunches, but the state money is about 82 to 84% of their revenue base.
What do you think?
Yeah, we agree. We think including the federal money in the calculation or even in the conversation really complicates and clouds the issue.
Okay, well, my research indicates about 12% of the money from the education gets, K through 12, comes from the federal government. So a small portion, most of it obviously comes from the state and local. Let me go back to that phase-in situation again. You were talking about a 5 to 7 year phase-in. What are your thoughts on the phase-in period?
You know, the idea of phasing in is really, it really is a good idea. Nobody ever intended that this was going to happen all at once. And even if that's what we were talking about, if we were talking about let's just change everything now, in order for that to occur, you're going to have to get back to where we were. You get back to this $20 billion cut. That's got to be restored. And so what the phasing in the program does is it helps to account for that. But remember, we don't know what we're talking about yet. We haven't seen any models. We haven't seen anything. But that's coming. And the governor's staff is going to have that out pretty soon, and we're going to be able to take a look at what's really operational once this thing is in place.
Well, let me ask you, Mike, about something that L.A. Times columnist George Skelton recently wrote about. He had an interesting take on the governor's proposal. He suggested that redistribution of education dollars from middle-class suburban districts to lower-income urban or rural districts are going to turn off suburban voters who've been trending toward the Democrats. What do you think?
Well, I think that the suburban voters will, in some cases, be upset, but when they see that they're going to get more money too, it's a question of who, as we ramp up, who gets, relatively more money. I think they'll see the sense that there is. Particularly when you have huge concentrations of low-income students where the parents and the community rarely speak English, for example, that's a much harder lift for these kids. We also haven't talked about the revenue side. The legislature, I think, will be considering new revenue measures for local districts. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, you could lower the parcel tax, which is a tax on property, from 2/3 vote to 55%. You could give local school districts the ability to raise general revenue like sales taxes. And the middle-class communities are more likely to be able to pass these measures and have more tax base to do it.
That could be part of a whole package deal.
Yeah, you could have revenue and distribution.
Let me ask you one last question, and that is, what do you think the prospects are for fundamental restructuring of school finance this year?
I think the prospects are good. And I think it's also important to reiterate. The idea that it costs more to educate certain students than others, and now right in the middle of the school funding conversation, and that's good. The fact that the governor is engaging the educators and the education community in this debate is promising. We got a lot of work to do between now and when we see this budget.
Quick answer, Mike?
I think within the next year or two, it's good. The whole atmosphere after we passed Proposition 13 has changed. The budget has changed. The idea was floated last year. We're beginning to get more understanding, so I'm pretty confident.
Oh, great. Well, I want to thank Mike Christ with the California Board of Education, Dean Vogel with the California Teachers Association, and Rachel Ellers with the California Legislative Analyst Office for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for our award-winning e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
If any issue ought to have full and widespread support, it ought to be education. It is the essential investment for our society that pays ongoing dividends for generations. California's public education system was once the envy of the world. and the vital engine that drove its development and prosperity. In recent years, California's education system has been tinkered with, borrowed against, reformed, studied, refunded, reformed again, and reinvented. California schools, teachers, and students are just seeking a little consistency. That is nowhere more evident than in the realm of school funding. Ever since Proposition 13 in 1978 set off changes in state financing, especially in education, California has not been able to maintain a reliable, equitable, and comprehensible system of funding for schools on any level. Local K-12 school districts have been struggling with year-to-year budgets subject to the volatility of politics and finances in Sacramento. They have had to watch helplessly as the legislature has borrowed from their funding to balance the state budget. California colleges have had to increase tuition and fees to balance their budgets. Tuition in California universities and community colleges has doubled in the past dozen years. School administrators would welcome any plan where they could compile their budgets with dependable revenue. It appears California will have some budget stability for the time being. In that climate, it would be important for state policymakers to set a system of education funding that will be sustainable and equitable. If that requires reform in structure and policy, let's make those adjustments. This is also a time when both parties can demonstrate leadership by making education funding reform a priority. There will be differences in details of that reform, but both sides ought to agree on the basis for reliable and consistent funding levels that don't make California school children pawns in ideological gamesmanship. Senator Ken Maddy tried to stay above the partisan conflict that is the bane of productive discourse and policy making. He would rather set aside a political principle to achieve pragmatic progress. The Maddy Institute is devoted to a bipartisan, pragmatic approach to government and promotes education and involvement in public policy. The same lesson can be taught with several different lesson plans. The learning is the important thing. Policymakers have an opportunity to get this lesson plan for education right. California's teachers and students won't care whose signature is on the diploma, as long as they can get one.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.